All right, in this video, I want to accomplish a couple of things. First of all, is just to see what it looks like when I have a hat on, because it's just a little bit more convenient for me sometimes to wear a hat, and so if it seems all right, I might do that a little bit more. But more importantly, I'm working on one of my longer articles, my more involved articles. It's going to touch on an issue related to communion. And while I was thinking about that, I started to think, well, what is communion going to look at the Potter's Church? Maybe it's a good idea to have an explanation of that because people come from a lot of different positions and traditions on that. So I thought I could go ahead and spell out some of the things that are going to be involved with that. And so first of all, I guess is the name. There's a few different names, communion, Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, all of those sorts of things. Communion is just what I tend to know it by the most myself. The name's not the most important thing, but it's probably what I'll continue to refer to it as, and so it means that's what the church will probably do also. More importantly than that, of course, is what communion accomplishes. It's one of the, from my perspective, theological, doctrinal perspective, it's one of the ordinances of the church. And so it's not a sacrament because it doesn't confer grace. Yeah, it doesn't have that kind of sacerdotal aspect to it where it somehow accomplishes something spiritual that cannot be accomplished otherwise. As an ordinance, it is a symbol. It symbolizes the reality that we already have when we are believers. And so the bread represents the breaking of the Lord's body, the juice will represent the spilling of his blood. And that's really what matters in this, is remembering what Christ did, not necessarily expecting something out of this religious ritual. All right, so that's probably the most important thing because there are different ways of looking at that. Another one that is worth mentioning, I just said juice, and that's what we'll use. Because some churches use wine, others use juice. We'll be in that latter camp. Worth pointing out. Another thing, probably more important, is who can take communion in a church like the Potter's Church. And we're going to have an open approach to communion. So some churches have closed communion, and what that means, at least as I understand it, is that that's just for the members of the church. And the reason that they do that is because they really want to make the point of how special it is and that it belongs to believers. And so the people that they feel are confirmed believers are going to be those who have gone through the process of becoming members in their church. And so those are the people that they're comfortable giving the elements of communion to. We're not going to take that approach. I don't really want to be investigating whether someone is a believer or not in that sense. Obviously, I do want to help people understand where salvation comes from, but if somebody wants to take communion, then it's going to be left up to them. We're not going to bar the door to them on that count if they are not members of our church. Now, we will make it very clear who communion is for. Communion is not just for anybody. Communion is supposed to be for people who actually associate the meaning with it. People who are Christians, people who believe that Jesus died and rose again for their salvation and that they have that forgiveness of sins if they have trusted in him for it. And so we will emphasize that it's not just a teensy tiny meal, that it actually does have meaning. It's representational meaning. It doesn't actually, again, it's not sacred in and of itself, but that meaning is important, and those are the people who should partake in it, and hopefully those who are not members of the body of Christ, the larger church, the universal church, that they will not take it on their own volition. But again, that's not an issue where I'm going to be looking to apply a test. And if somebody's not a Christian and they happen to take communion, I'm not going to come down on them with a hammer for it because that's just something that they're not understanding. We do want to be, again, to have it open. What was the other thing that I wanted to say about that? How frequently we're going to have it. Because some churches do it monthly, others are quarterly, others are weekly. We'll do it weekly. And again, this is not something where the Bible spells it out specifically how often you have to do it, but it does look like in the early church that it was the common practice to do communion every week, and I see no reason not to do it every week. It is good to frequently have that reminder of Christ's work on our behalf. And so that's going to be the approach that we take. And I'm pretty sure that covers everything that I was thinking about saying, but it obviously doesn't cover everything that could be said about this aspect of a worship service. So if you have something that you want to share, maybe from your own tradition on this, oh, that's what it was. I'll swing back. I'll just leave this right in there and come back to that. It was how you take communion, because some churches have it where you'll have the bread and the cup at the front of wherever the service is taking place, and you'll either be given the elements of communion or you'll take the piece of bread and you'll dip it into the cup. And other churches do it where you will pass plates through the aisles, and the aisles will have small pieces of bread, or the plates will have small pieces of bread, and there also will have a plate that will have individual cups. And I kind of see the value in both ways, but just personally, I'm not super comfortable with the idea of sharing a single cup because we live in a very hygienic age, or people are concerned about the spreading of germs, the spreading of disease. And it doesn't mean that God can't and in general does not protect against that. I mean, there are thousands of churches that do things that way, and they're not generally more sick than other churches are. So I can see doing that, and maybe on occasion we will do that, but I think in general we'll probably use the plates. So I do think now that covers everything that I was going to say here. But if you've seen it done differently, or if you have suggestions on ways to do it, or maybe questions about the ways that I'm talking about doing it, feel free to put any of that in the comments below. If you want to get involved with the church, or if you have more of a private discussion that you want to have, my email address is in the description, Facebook's in the description, and you can message me there if you'd like to do that. If you would please, as always, be praying for the Potter's Church, for what's going on here, that the Lord would guide this process, take us to where we need to be. Stop the video, or the video is about to be over. Once it stops, pray before you move on to whatever comes next. Thank you very much for following along with this process. And until I talk to you next time, keep looking up.